On this episode of China Unscripted, 2019 was the year China changed the world. Will 2020 be the year the world changes China? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
I'm afraid I've got some bad news tonight. The tea that we are drinking tonight from Path of Cha, our sponsors, is so good, it's almost sold out.
Is it? I haven't had it yet.
Well, try it, enjoy. Tonight we are drinking tea called Frozen Summit, Dong Ding Oolong tea. Smell, this is one of Taiwan's most precious tea, the Taiwan province of China.
Yes.
Yeah, this is...
The Taiwan province of China that's about to have their own presidential election.
You know, regional, local elections. Holy cow, this is a really good tea. Sorry, guys, you were going to want to buy this tea, but it is almost sold out because of high demand. I think this is one of my favorites we've had all year. Very appropriate for the end-of-the-year podcast.
Frozen Summit, huh?
I thought that was the most Christmassy sounding.
Are there frozen summits in Taiwan?
Taiwan is very high mountains. This one comes from a mountain that is 1,000 meters high. That's like 200 feet.
Well, I mean, it is true that a lot of Taiwan's tea, right, is like high mountain something tea. So
Yeah.
like Ali Shan tea, right? But that I don't know how high that is. Does it snow on Ali Shan?
It's pretty high. I don't know if it's as high as this. I mean, this is called Dongding Frozen Summit. Dongding means frozen summit because it is grown so high up. So it gives it like a fruity, kind of honey caramel taste. Do you say caramel or caramel?
I say
I say caramel.
caramel now, but I grew up kind of saying caramel, I think.
Yeah.
There's a city in California called Carmel.
Oh,
So
yes.
I used to get those mixed up.
I love both.
This is one of those regional pronunciation things.
Like a submarine sandwich and hoagie.
Hoagie, grinders, yeah.
Grinders, which is owned by a Chinese company.
Not for long.
Uh-huh. If anyone is confused, we are not talking about the sandwich. We are talking about the gay dating app, Grindr. Just so people weren't concerned their sandwiches were owned by China.
I'm pretty sure now if you said grinder, most people would think of the dating app
You
before
think?
the sandwich. Well, maybe not in whichever region of the United States says
Are you sure this
Grindr.
isn't your own bias, Shelley?
What kind of bias?
So if you'd like to have some tea, go to go.pathofcha.com/unscripted. It will, everything you buy through that link will kind of help out the podcast. So, it's a great way to get yourself some great tea and support our work. And again, tonight's tea is Frozen Summit Dongding Oolong Tea, medium roast. It's almost sold out, so fight for it. Fight.
When you were mentioning the idea of your sandwich being owned by China, I was thinking about how Chinese companies have been buying up like big American food producers.
Oh, you mean like Smithfield Pork?
Right.
Oh.
And so like you could have a sandwich where actually there's like some of that meat. I mean, maybe not pork now because of the swine flu and the prices and stuff, but you could have a sandwich with, chicken or turkey or pork where the company that's providing that is owned by China and possibly some of the meat itself is coming from China.
So
I think they're buying them to get the American pork into China, not necessarily to bring Chinese pork to the U.S.
Yeah, that seems to be what the case is because it's the quality of American meat is still better.
So this isn't like cars where 5/8 of your car was manufactured in North America. Your
Like-
sandwich is not 5/8
I thought
manufactured
you were
in
gonna
China.
I thought you meant the pig was 5/8 manufactured in China. It is one thing I learned through this whole swine flu thing is that China has pork reserves. I didn't know that before.
I mean, that shows the dedication to pork. I admire that, actually.
They have frozen pork reserves that they were slowly releasing some of their reserves to try to keep the pork prices down. Because
I wonder whose job it is to guard that. I bet they feel a lot of pride with that job.
Guarding the frozen bacon.
Like
Yeah.
there are silos somewhere in Inner Mongolia.
Or somewhere. Probably, yeah, it would be in the north.
Wait, so you're assuming that the pork reserves are frozen?
They are frozen.
Okay.
What?
Well, because another way to have pork reserves is to have government-run pork farms where you have live animals. But
Oh, interesting. I did always assume it was just like stored carcasses.
It's definitely frozen pork reserves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
yeah, but anyway, China's had a very rough year in terms of pork.
Well, I think the pigs are the ones that have had the really rough year.
Yes, the communist pigs. Is that offensive? Should I not say that?
It is. I think many pigs would be offended.
Pigs are wonderful. I shouldn't compare them to communists. At least pigs provide something to the world. Oh.
Ooh.
All right. Well, what a way to end the year.
I think we're all a little tired.
Yeah, that is, I think, so this is going to be sort of a year in review, a cap to the year of everything we've done. And I think the overwhelming theme is we're very, very tired after this year. This has been in many ways, it's been a wonderful year. In many ways, it's just been soul eroding, tiring.
I think it's been the most interesting year for China Uncensored. I mean,
interesting is one of those words that you say like when you don't want to say that
It was terrible.
It was
right?
terrible. Yeah.
It's like what is attributed to be an ancient Chinese blessing and curse. May you live in interesting times.
Which is not. It was said by some white guy in the 20th century.
right. I know that's
Yeah.
that's why I hedged it when I said it, because I knew you'd correct me.
Ancient
Yes.
Chinese culture has been a part of Europe since ancient times.
And it is becoming so again, which is actually one of the big things that's happened this year, which is with China's Belt and Road expanding into Western European countries.
Europe is what?
I think you said that ancient Chinese culture has been a part of Europe since ancient times or something like that.
Because it was a twist, because it was the white guy.
Right.
saying-
And then what I said kind of made no sense. But it was a complete non sequitur, but also a statement of something that has happened this year.
But you did prove my point that we're exhausted.
I don't think when we were really exhausted was when we were trying to do the podcasts in Hong Kong.
Yes. Well, so I was going to say, year in review, what was your favorite moment of the year?
Favorite moment of the year?
Hopefully related to this show.
Well,
Any of our shows.
I think in terms of like, if I'm going to be earnest and serious for a moment, it probably was standing on top of that overpass footbridge over Hennessy Road, watching 2 million people march through the streets of Hong Kong on, what was that, June
16th.
16th, yeah.
That was pretty darn cool.
That was incredible. Yeah. And we saw a lot of, Hong Kong protests from that footbridge, and then we were later tear gassed from police who were standing on that footbridge.
Yes, we had a tear in our eye. Well, no, the 2 million protest day wasn't tear gas.
No. I'm just saying,
Oh, in the
through the
future.
course of the Hong Kong protests, we saw at least 3 protests from that footbridge,
bridge.
right? And then maybe 4, actually. And then we were also tear gassed from that footbridge.
From the police who were standing on the
yeah,
footbridge.
in the last,
shooting tear gas down at us.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. So that wasn't on June 16th. That was on October or September 30th or 29th with the
Yeah.
anti-totalitarianism.
We definitely
Rally.
spent about a month of the year in total in Hong Kong.
Yep.
How about you, Matt? Do you have one?
Yeah.
It better not be the one I'm going to say.
Oh, I was going to say it was actually covering October 1st, National Day in Hong Kong.
Ah, okay. Similar but different to Shelley.
Yeah, well, that was one of the days that we got tear gassed. But that's not. But my favorite moment was in that day, and it was after we'd been tear gassed, we'd been running to/from police, like to them to get footage and away from them when they were tear gassing us, And then we got stuck in that alleyway where they were like blocking us off. And then we were walking back. It was just you and me, Chris. And we walked by the Five Guys burger. And they saw that there was a group of us who were reporters. And everyone in Five Guys, they looked at us and they raised up their 5 fingers, like the 5 demands, but it was like a show of support and like a thank you for reporting.
I thought they were Nazis.
Wow, way to ruin my touching moment, Chris.
Well, I had to do something to inflate my own.
Well, you didn't tell me that story. I didn't.
We told you that story, Shelley. I know we did.
Did you? I don't remember the whole like people raising their hands up part.
Yeah, well, I have a photo of it, which I guess I'll
Which
put
is very meaningful for the podcast.
Well, no, but if you're watching this on YouTube, look at the screen now, and then you can see it, okay? So that's enough. All right, see, Shelley, here's the photo.
You definitely didn't show me this.
You can see why I thought they were Nazis, right?
Yes, that little old Hong Kong lady looks like a Nazi.
Hey, I don't judge who is and who isn't a Nazi based on their looks. I judge people by their actions, Shelley.
So, Chris, what was your favorite moment of the year?
Well, there was this moment we were walking past a Five Guys. And,
and then we went inside and ate at the Five Guys?
Yeah, and they had the shakes. I've never had a Five Guys shakes before. No, I have slightly deeper waters than that. It was also in Hong Kong, though. It was a simple moment where we met a fan of the show who was actually from, I think he said San Diego.
Oh,
yeah. Yes, it was
Cruz.
San Diego.
I know who you're talking about,
Yeah. And he was like, fan of the show. He's been watching our coverage of Hong Kong, and he was just so moved by what the protesters were doing, and he wanted to give some kind of support. So every 2 weeks, for at least a month or more, he was flying out to Hong Kong to join in the protest and support the protesters. That blew me away.
Yeah, I mean, and he was talking about how he felt like at least he could do that to show support for the protesters and then tell his friends and family back in San Diego about the protests so they can understand what people in Hong Kong were doing. And he felt like especially people fighting for their freedoms is something that he wanted to help with in some way.
Yeah.
That was pretty incredible. I think that was also October 1st.
Yeah, it was definitely on our our National Day trip to Hong Kong. Yeah. But that kind of ties into a general feeling I've been getting all year that people's view of China has changed dramatically. And I don't like to toot our own horns, but I think we have played at least a small role in that.
This is something that I thought started in 2012. Or maybe the tail end of 2017, because that's when I was like, guys, we should go to Australia. Mm-hmm. This is when they were having their whole, scandal with like members of parliament being essentially bought off by billionaires connected to the Chinese Communist Party. And
you had Sam Dastyari with his whole,
like
Beijing Bob Carr.
Well, he's not an MP, but yeah, the whole like idea that they had like this, political class and and people who were influential in society who were kind of bought off by the CCP or influenced by the CCP through different, United Front work essentially, and it seemed like people were starting to wake up to this fact. We were in Australia when Clive Hamilton published his book about this issue, Silent Invasion, and talking to people in Australia and New Zealand, and I thought, oh, this is the beginning of when the Western liberal democracies start to understand what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing all these years. But then it seemed to kind of not die down exactly, but there was a lot of like
kind of idled for a little while.
Well, it was kind of like there was a lot of opposition to that, where,
then you had
people saying, well, like if you talk about this is racism, to talk about the Chinese Communist Party, or what if it becomes a yellow peril thing where people who are Chinese just get suspected of being spies or all this. Like, that's not what we want to do. And I think also a lot of people were like, oh, this is being, overblown. There's too many China hawks. Like, it's not that bad. Like, we need to engage with China. Like, the
same old Kissinger.
Yeah.
kind of.
So, like, then you kind of saw that backlash. So I was like, oh, maybe this is not happening. And then Hong Kong came along.
Yeah, Hong Kong, I think, was the thing that really changed it globally, especially in the United States. I mean, there's been the trade war. There has been an increasing awareness of Chinese Communist Party influence in the United States. But I think it was everything tied to Hong Kong that really, at least for Americans, and probably liberal democracies around the world, kind of changed things, because you saw people fighting for their freedoms from the Communist Party, and then you saw how different people and organizations that were bought off by the Chinese Communist Party, how they responded to the protests.
Right. I think the key moment for that, for American awareness, was when Daryl Morey of the Houston Rockets tweeted that image of support for Hong Kong, and then
The subsequent NBA backlash, the backlash to the backlash, the backlash to the backlash,
to the backlash.
Yeah.
And and then just like all sorts of people who paid zero attention to China were like, oh, wait a second, China's a dictatorship.
Yeah.
Everyone except Michael Bloomberg
I
realizes
knew that was
now.
coming.
Oh, Michael Bloomberg. I'm a little worried about Biden, too.
I think those are kind of different things. Like what Biden was saying was that the China's not a competitor for the U.S. because we're so much stronger. But
Yes, but I was just thinking about what you were telling us a week ago when you were listening to the old...
when I found the Senate records of the debate over granting China permanent most favored nation trading status. This was back in 99, early 2000, and they're terribly hard to read because it's like written in these like tiny columns, like the way that newspapers were 100 years ago or something like that. And so you're trying to read it. It's very difficult, but it's fascinating too because you can see what the people's arguments were about why we should grant this trade status to China, why we shouldn't.
We have to engage with China.
Yeah, and Biden was in the we should grant most permanent most favored nation trade status to China. And his main argument was, we've tried tying trade to human rights. Like what we're currently doing isn't working to get them to improve their human rights. So we should try a different thing, which
is like what Clinton said.
Yes,
Bill Clinton.
What the whole we need to engage to get them to, change, or, the more economically free they are, the more politically free
Yeah,
they'll be.
the best way to bring democracy to China is to engage with an authoritarian government. I mean, it really makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like now in hindsight, of
In
course,
hindsight.
right?
Which is why I can forgive the mistake, but like at this point it should be clear that was a disaster, and so I think there should be a little more like, hey, I said this, I realize now that was a mistake that has seriously damaged our country and made the Communist Party a global threat. My bad.
Well, one thing I've realized recently is that it's not so clear to people who look at it from a certain angle what exactly the CCP is doing. Like how, do I want to use the word nefarious? Like,
Yeah.
It is, because we were reading that article in Foreign Affairs magazine from Fareed Zakaria, who was basically arguing that China is actually becoming, like, engagement didn't fail. China actually has been becoming more and more of a responsible international stakeholder and all these things. And if you look at his specific examples, he's not lying, or, the examples he gave were accurate, but a totally ignoring what
The big picture thing.
or what they've really been doing under the surface. Like on the surface, sure, they're donating more to the UN, all this kind of stuff. But like they're part of the UN peacekeeping force. But they're also corrupting the UN in a lot of ways. There's been a lot of corruption scandals linked to Chinese Communist Party money. In the end, there's been they're basically making things like the UN Human Rights Council
meaningless,
an ineffective body, all this kind of stuff. So you can't just look at what's happening on the surface or what they say they're doing. You have to look a little deeper. On one hand, you could say, the Belt and Road is them engaging more in the world, and
or they brought the internet to Africa. That's great. They're helping Africa.
Yes.
But really, that's a form of disinformation, and I don't know if that's just they're ignorant about what's really happening, or if they're knowingly spreading disinformation.
I mean, and a lot of times these are really smart people who are engaged a lot with international relations.
I don't understand. How can a smart person have an opinion different than mine? That means they're wrong.
Well, I think the thing is that this is the problem, that if you treat China like a normal country, you don't look at what is happening with the Chinese Communist Party, then it's easy to kind of make those arguments that, essentially the Chinese Communist Party is also making.
Well, it's especially nefarious because the way the Communist Party operates is often they do break laws, but many of the tactics they use are not in clear violation of any laws. So, for example, in the U.S., we have freedom of press. So they have state-run Chinese media operate out of the United States, join the U.S. Press Club, influence speakers, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, yeah. When we were in the National Press Club the other day, we saw People's Daily.
Yeah.
We forgot to take a selfie in front of the door.
Oh, but I did grab a picture. So we were in D.C. recently, and I think a lot of these themes were on everybody's lips and hearts and minds.
It's just... Yeah, it's interesting because this is the kind of pushback that we're talking about, right? Like this article by Fareed Zakaria in the Foreign Affairs. And I think this is going to be what happens in 2012, where there's going to...
2020?
2020. Oh my, did I say 2012?
We're going back.
I meant 2020.
Oh, wow.
To when we started the show.
Oh, man. Was it that long ago?
It was.
Well, anyway, my point was that this is the debate or argument or back and forth, I think, that's going to be there. Yeah. It's happening already this year, but it's going to keep happening more and more.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I thought they were from some of the speakers at the events we went to in D.C., one of the things that kept coming up is the need to educate your average American about what's been happening between the U.S. and China. That is the biggest thing that can be done to address the situation. And I think some of the people we talked to were very grateful that is sort of what we have been doing.
That did make me feel
like we haven't been wasting 7 years of our life.
Well, yeah, like I said earlier this year, you feel like you're just you're Cassandraing right into the void.
Mm-hmm.
Did you just verb Cassandra?
Yes, I did. You're, screaming into the void about, trying to warn people, and everybody's like, it's just a big horse.
Yeah. So, Shelley, do you want to, for those who were not educated in Greek mythology, do you want to just briefly explain that?
That Cassandra in Greek mythology, was a woman who was cursed to be able to foretell the future, and also no one would ever believe her. And she was one of the people in Troy who was like, don't let the Trojan horse in. That she tried to physically stop them from bringing in the gates, and everybody was like, it's fine.
Yep. So yeah, I definitely, there have been times I've definitely felt like that over the past several years. Especially it doesn't happen so much anymore, but when somebody was like, I thought China was a democracy. Don't they have a president? And then it's like, you fool.
What happens? Do you explode?
They explode. I have nothing to do with it if any law enforcement is asking or listening.
I mean, but also sometimes the stories that we covered years and years ago are only finally coming to light. I think one of the things that the show had covered in like the very like first year, so this is like 2012 and 2013, you were talking about like, oh, like Chinese state-run hospitals are killing Falun Gong practitioners for their organs. And
Yeah,
everyone's
that was
like,
this year.
like, that's such a conspiracy. There's no way that could happen. You know, if it's happening at all, it's convicted criminals of like, you know, these kind of things. And like, you're like, no, the numbers don't add up. It doesn't make sense. And like, look at all this proof. And like, these Canadian people have like come up with this book that has all the details. Like, just believe it. And you know,
I mean, at that time, there'd already been 5 or 6 years of people looking into it.
right.
Coming out with pretty hard evidence.
Right, but it was still widely considered to be a conspiracy theory.
Oh, I know people who still can't really bring themselves to believe it because it's...
Oh yeah, but I think like it is, the evidence hasn't gotten particularly more abundant this year. But I think the big thing that changed was there was an organ harvesting tribunal where it took course over like about 6 months, starting actually in last December.
2018, yeah.
And
But
then
had
they
their
did like a
final
few
ruling.
different hearings, and the final judgment was in like June or something. And the guy who was the chair of the tribunal was the guy who did the Slobodan Milosevic trials. And like what, like I watched a lot of footage from it, and it was, you know, like a very like long, drawn out kind of, not that interesting to watch. But
Wasn't an episode of China Uncensored.
it was, well, I mean, we covered it
I
a couple times.
I get
but-
what Chris is saying.
Thank you, Shelley.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Did I mention we're tired?
But yeah, I mean, like, but what was interesting was that because they had this process and because they had a forum for all this evidence to come together in a very professional way, and I think the people on the panel went into it without like they weren't ready to condemn the Communist Party for organ harvesting when they went into it. They kind of went into it waiting for evidence.
Well, that was the whole point, right? To see what the evidence was.
Right. And then once they ruled that, like, the evidence suggests that, yeah, this is definitely happening. And then actually a lot of media who had been completely dismissive of this for years and years and years were, like, writing articles like, China is killing people for organs. And it's
Well,
like, wow, this is actually happening in a lot of the mainstream media now.
I think it's because the media didn't have to say it. They could just quote the tribunal saying it.
Which also
Yeah.
makes it seem like, hey, look at this news story that just came out that we haven't been ignoring for a decade.
Well, I had heard from like reporters who had tried to cover this issue that like one of the problems they had with trying to get it covered is people would always be like, oh, but what's new? Like this story is, 6-7 years old. Like, so they would have a
And
hard
like, sure,
time.
we didn't cover it then, but we can't cover it now either.
It's a difficult situation, I think, because if you looked at the evidence, it was pretty clear that something was happening, but it was hard to. It's kind of like the thing where you needed like 3 hearings of a tribunal to go through all the evidence, right? It's not like, you had all these doctors going like, I operated on. You had a couple people, but it wasn't so cut and dry, like a whistleblower kind of thing. So it was difficult for people to wrap their heads around.
And I mean, it is also hard to go from I thought China was a democracy with a president to, they're doing what?
Yeah.
To who?
That's
also an issue that like a lot of people still have never heard of Falun Gong. So.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's also helped was like the slow like realization in the last 2 years of 3 years of what's happening with the Uyghurs. I guess it really started ramping up in 2017.
The persecution of Uyghurs.
The persecution of the Uyghurs. So kind of, the actual rounding up of people and putting them in these concentration camps.
Which is
and
a
stuff
lot
like that.
clearer to see than the main victims of organ harvesting so far, Falun Gong practitioners, which were kind of scattered all the way out throughout China.
Yeah, and
scattered
also-
makes it seem small, but there was tens of millions of them.
Also, they were through like the regular labor camp system. They weren't building
Military hospitals.
Yeah, like they weren't building new facilities that we could clearly see through satellite imagery and all this kind
Yeah.
of stuff.
They had spent a lot of money in the early 2000s building new re-education through labor camps. That was one of the things Jiang Zemin, who was the fake president at the time, was spending tens of billions of dollars on, is ramping up that system. But, like you said, like you one particular re-education through labor camp, it wasn't like all Falun Gong. They had a lot of different criminals and also different political dissidents and also Falun Gong. So you had like different groups and it was mixed, and you couldn't walk down the street and see like, oh, this person's a Falun Gong practitioner, this person is not. So it's very hard to like delineate that. Whereas in Xinjiang, it's like you can recognize the Uyghur people, and it's like in a very concentrated area.
I mean, it's where they are. It's not. Yeah. I mean, I think people are getting worried about the Uyghurs being sent to other places throughout China, like if they close these concentration camps and kind of disappear the Uyghurs into the system throughout the rest of China. That's kind of what happened with the Falun Gong, where they would, move them from camp to camp so that you would kind of disappear.
Yeah. And so the big concern now is that the Uyghurs will become the next biggest donors to the organ system.
Well, I think with the Uyghurs, too, in a sense, organ harvesting started with them back in
That's
the 90s.
Right.
Where before it was before their technology had really caught up, they were just shooting people in the chest and then taking their organs out. So
that was where the first story of this kind of came.
Yeah,
out.
I mean, like the real first incidents of this actually happened in the 70s to a political prisoner, but like maybe during the Cultural Revolution. But this was, that wasn't. The technology, and China's medical establishment was definitely not sophisticated enough to do this at the scale that they're doing it now.
Yeah. And then when you hear stories about like U.S. companies like Thermo Fisher providing DNA sequencers to Xinjiang authorities, like how big of a role has the West played in this really disgusting crime against humanity?
Well, I mean, consider all like the pharmaceutical drugs that you need and the technology you need just to do transplants. Like transplants are a very sophisticated operation, and the technology has improved a lot in the last 20 years. A part of that is because actually China was a driving force in experimenting, because they were able to experiment. They had an unlimited base of donors. Well, it's just so horrifying. But yeah, and then you combine that with Western companies providing equipment, providing pharmaceuticals.
Oh God,
it's just.
And this is making me think about like Biden and everyone else who's arguing. Look, we haven't been able to reform China with trade. We need to do more economic deals with them. That's going to change it.
Well, I think. At the time Biden said that, or at the time this debate was going on, the crackdown on Falun Gong had already begun.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think this is going to be the thing that comes out in the next couple of years. What have, these...
How complicit?
Yeah, these organizations or companies, like, what have they done to basically facilitate this whole thing? I mean, the Transplantation Society has refused to really acknowledge this for years.
They've been very supportive of China's organ donation system.
And it's not the whole medical establishment in the West. Like, I know somebody who used to work for a European transplant journal. I forget the name right now. I don't want to say, there are a couple with like very similar names, and I don't want to get it wrong. But she said that eventually their journal stopped taking papers from China because they couldn't guarantee, that the subjects weren't political prisoners used in these experiments. But yeah, there's a lot of pushback. The Vatican earlier this year had this year or last year, they had a, conference on transplantation that they invited China to be a major part of.
Yeah, the Vatican has been terrible on China as of late.
But it's not very well known yet, but I think that's going to be the next thing that comes out.
Something to look forward to in perhaps 2020.
Yeah, so what else has been some of the big news this year?
Well, I think this was a crazy year because of all the anniversaries. There was, how many anniversaries were there? There was
There's at least 4.
Well, there was the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Communist takeover of China, when we were in Hong Kong celebrating that with all the people of Hong Kong.
It's the 60th anniversary of the Communist Party's liberation of Tibet.
Mm-hmm. And then the next one would be the 30-year anniversary of the Tiananmen Square whoopsie daisy. Is that what we called it?
The Tiananmen Square, nothing happened here.
Exactly. And then you have the 20-year anniversary of the persecution of Falun Gong. And then the 10-year anniversary of the 2009 Urumqi Uyghur crackdown.
Yeah, there were protests / riots in Urumqi, which was the capital of Xinjiang. And
Those were, I believe, in 2008.
no, it was 2009.
Was it 2009?
Yeah.
Because it was the crackdown that definitely started in 2009.
Well, the crackdown was in response to those protests. It was all in 2009. And they actually ended up shutting off the internet in Xinjiang for months. Which, at the time, everyone was like, this is crazy, But, yeah.
I don't understand how people can live without the internet.
All 3 of us once did.
Oh.
Remember?
When we spent like 56 hours on that Filipino fishing boat.
I meant when we were children. Because remember, we predate the internet.
Oh my gosh, that's true.
Well, I think also, my parents were pretty early adopters of the internet. Like, we had a PC when I was growing up, so I feel like, yeah, we do predate it, but not by that much.
We're that weird generation that's like...
The Oregon Trail generation. Somebody wrote an
gosh.
article calling us the Oregon Trail generation.
Firstly, it's the Oregon Trail, not Oregon.
Well, the Oregon Trail is a zombie version of the Oregon Trail.
No, but like, don't you pronounce, like, Chris, you're from California.
Oregon.
Oregon, thank you. That's
Oregon, not Oregon.
Oregon. Yeah, not Oregon. It's Oregon.
This is like those submarine sandwiches, hoagie.
Yeah.
Maybe this is because I grew up in Pittsburgh. I don't know.
And you used to call soda pop.
Yes.
But I'm not going to hold that against you.
And I called
very much longer.
subs hoagies.
A lot of divisive pronunciations are divisive.
Anyway, so other than correcting my pronunciation, the point I was going to make was...
Oh, I hear it. I hear the bitterness.
It was just a total derail. You knew what I was talking about.
We're all very tired. Not all of us might make it to 2020.
Well, I'm not going to make it to 2020 if Shelley strangles me.
No jury would convict me.
Oh, that's probably true.
Anyway, the point was that we lived through all of these massive technological changes. Starting from using floppy disks to play Oregon Trail.
Thank you.
MS-DOS, like all this kind of stuff, to the full-blown internet and social media and all this stuff. Sometimes I forget, for example, that in 2003 there was no Facebook or YouTube or Wikipedia, because it feels like that's been around for so long.
Same thing with smartphones. I remember when, like, I had a friend who was like, "Did you get my text?" And I was like, "What is a text?"
I would never text because I hated trying to type out text messages on the number pad.
Oh, but that's great because then you can be in class and just, where all the numbers are and you can carry on a whole text conversation with those primitive buttons we used to press.
I remember texting on my flip phone. Actually, I still have the same flip phone I had when I came to New York in 2005. And remember when we did that episode where Chris and I were in Florida and you were like, it was the 24 spoof?
Oh, yeah, nobody got that it was a 24 spoof.
And like we used that phone I had that was like more than a decade old, and it was the flip phone. And people were like, why are you using a flip phone?
And people were like, oh, no, it's really smart for, security reasons to use a flip phone.
A burner phone. Yeah.
It was because we were doing a 24 spoof, but anyway.
I mean, you can get an iPhone as a burner phone if you want.
That seems like a waste.
It would have to be a very rich spy or whatever.
Actually, no, I remember this news report from several years back where Brian Williams, when he still used to be a star news anchor, went to Russia, and his burner phone was an iPhone.
Wow.
We don't have NBC News's budget.
No, we
No.
don't. Well, also he was making something like $10 million a year. So,
Like, what does that even mean? Anyway, so, technological changes that happened very quickly, and then we forget what it was like before that. But this actually does tie into these things where we're talking about why organ harvesting wasn't believed for so long, or why people didn't like really understand the scale of what was happening to Falun Gong, because you couldn't look at Google Earth in 2002 and see, them building
researchers
new,
wouldn't get it.
them building new labor camps or whatever. You couldn't get some of this data that we now have to, substantiate what's happening.
Yeah. And speaking of technology, one of the things that it didn't start happening this year, but the exposure of this started happening in 2019 is big U.S. tech companies working with China in a way that their work ends up being used by or done in coordination with the Communist Party or even the Chinese military.
Yeah, not just U.S. tech companies, things like Australian universities working with Chinese military universities.
MIT University.
Right. And I think that like a lot of Western companies don't understand at first, at least, that the Communist Party has a policy of civil military fusion where companies are supposed to combine their technology with the military in the sense of like making it available, doing partnerships, this kind of thing, as a sort of national policy, a national strategy. And so for any Western company that works with a Chinese company or Chinese university, like that technology, if it's useful, will almost certainly be used by China's military, and you can't actually build a wall between those things.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of the question I was asking people in DC, just like with these tech companies, we now know that tech companies, they're like when they're doing AI facial recognition technology research with the Chinese military university, guess what? That technology is being used in Xinjiang to persecute the Uyghurs in these massive concentration camps where there might be organ harvesting happening, which also might tie into who knows how many pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, et cetera. And the question that is always on my mind, and I hope we get an answer to it, is it ignorance or is it do they know what they're doing and are horrible?
Yeah, I mean, they have to know what they're doing. But I would argue that in many cases, it wasn't clear at the very beginning what was happening. But certainly as they got into it, there's no way people at the top didn't understand what was happening. But then, like, you're invested, you've sunk costs, and then your reputation. And so the idea of pulling out then just becomes much harder to do. And then if you start to see money being made, then you can use all sorts of excuses to convince yourself that like it's really not so bad and you're doing things in accordance with Chinese law.
I just don't understand.
I think the
this.
accordance in Chinese law thing is big, where you can kind of use that to hide like the moral or ethical.
Hannah Arendt, banality of evil.
But like you're like, okay, well you hide behind the law, basically, where you're like, well, I'm following Chinese law. Like I have to censor.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what Hannah Arendt, the German Jewish philosopher, said about the Nazis, that most of them weren't evil as we understand that concept. They just had given up free choice and just went along with things. And then that's how you got that whole situation.
Well, I don't think this is tech companies giving up free choice. I think this is tech companies using it as a justification to, to justify what they want to do, which is to make money in China.
Well, so I mean, it could be they're like, hey, well, if they're using it for whatever, it's not, doesn't have anything to do with us. I don't know.
It's not right, but I'm just trying to like understand the mentality of how these companies can just like do it and think it's okay.
Well, I mean, did Cisco understand what they were building?
Well, they did, because one of the things that in the Cisco...
We're talking about the Great Firewall that they built.
Yeah, so Cisco helped the Chinese authorities build the Great Firewall, and there was a court case, and one of the pieces of evidence submitted to the court was a presentation. I think it was a PowerPoint presentation that suggested that this technology could be used to surveil Falun Gong practitioners. But that trial, I forget exactly what happened with it, but it was ended up being sort of dismissed on more of a technicality than on the merits of the case.
I think the issue was, could you really try this in a U.S. court?
Right, that's right.
I think it was Falun Gong practitioners trying to sue Cisco for producing technology that helped the Chinese Communist Party torture them, basically.
And organ harvest them. Yeah, it's pretty disgusting. I just don't understand that mentality of like, oh, for money, I would sell my soul. Doesn't make sense to me. Isn't virtue the most important thing? Hey?
I mean, sure, there's virtue, but what if you can make millions of dollars, Chris?
I'll take virtue.
Look, maybe
There's a reason I have student loan debt.
It's virtuous for a company to make a lot of profit for its shareholders.
For the shareholders, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how that's kind of, I mean, I'm not saying it's recently become a thing. It's always been a thing with publicly traded companies where they say, well, we have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize profit for shareholders. So we have to do this. Like, we have to take every opportunity to make money because that's our
purpose.
That's our purpose. That is our fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. And so that's one of those things that, like, yes, technically there is truth to that, but also it's really, really easy for greedy companies to hide behind that as an excuse to do really anything they want that maybe transgress morals as long as it doesn't technically violate laws.
Well, and that was kind of the thinking that was behind a lot of the push to give China most favored nation status, permanent trade. I'm tired, Shelley. Don't laugh at me.
Most favored nation status.
Most permanent.
No, it's permanent most favored nation.
Well, okay.
Favoring most permanent.
Okay. It's most favored nation trading status, and making it permanent meant that they didn't have to re-vote on it every year.
Which had been a condition after Tiananmen Square massacre. Yeah. Anyways, the point was that what Matt was saying was an argument for doing that.
Right, and
think of all the money we could make in China. It's worth it.
I don't think they said that in that way, at least not in Congress.
Not in that way.
Yes, but you also,
there was a lot of lobbying.
Yeah, like, so corporate lobbying is, it's a major influencer in public policy, and we all know how this works. But most presidents, regardless of political party, have felt like they need to, to a degree, listen to the lobbyists because those lobbyists are tied to the people that are funding their campaign, and even if it's their final term, they've got other people that are going to run for office, and so their party and so on. So there's a lot of pressure from lobbyists.
Yeah. Traitors and treason, I say.
I think that the lobbying issue is not really so much executive branch as there's a lot of issues with that in Congress.
I mean, China's doing all kinds of things to influence Congress, buying off politicians, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I think also what happens is you have a lot of people who worked in government or politicians, then after they stop, they go become lobbyists, right?
Yep.
I think there was actually some cases where a few fairly prominent Congress people went to work for a lobbying firm that got hired by the Chinese government to lobby for them on Capitol Hill. So
wonderful. Why is that allowed? Because technically it's not breaking any laws.
No.
And that's the problem.
I mean, a lot of people have talked about this issue.
Yeah. It's a part of China's unrestricted warfare? Or is it
not just
warfare?
China, but the whole, the whole, cycle of you're on Wall Street and then you're in the government, then you're back in Wall Street, or you're in government, then you become a lobbyist, and then it's...
Yeah.
Well, I think what we really need is a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Ooh, hey, I could lead it. For life.
Do you feel like you are the proletariat, Chris?
Sure, I have debt. So this definitely has been a very busy and eventful year for us. What do you think 2020 will hold? I'm guessing at least 2 presidential elections.
Wow. Thank you, Nostradamus.
Ah, you'll only understand what I said 1,000 years from now.
Well, I think that there's going to be a lot more of this confrontation between the Chinese Communist Party and, Western liberal democracies, or the Hong Kong issue is not going to go away. I mean, they've kept
Yeah.
it up for 6 months now. It doesn't show any sign of people being like, all right,
It's still getting...
let's go home, guys.
Yeah, it's
You know?
still getting like almost 1 million people out there, that
Right.
large scale.
And so the next elections in Hong Kong for the legislature are in September 2020.
Yep.
And so I would not be the least bit surprised if protests continued on a regular or semi-regular basis.
Flaring before the election.
Yeah.
Well, I think also because the Hong Kong government has not shown any sign of, acquiescing to any of the protesters' demands, which they cannot because the Chinese Communist Party will not let them.
So this was the year of anniversaries. Next year will be the year of elections.
Yeah, I mean,
true.
it looks like Tsai Ing-wen will probably win
In Taiwan.
in Taiwan at this moment, which it did not look that certain at all.
Before the Hong Kong protests, it didn't. It looked like she wouldn't even get the nomination from her party to run for president.
Well, and I think it was also her challenger for the KMT, Han Kuo-yu, was, this like upstart, like populist, personality guy, and people were like, oh, well, he's gonna win, but there's also clearly a lot of Chinese Communist Party interference and influence
And there still
in
is.
the Taiwan election related to trying to boost Han Kuo-yu, the KMT, because they'd rather have a party that's friendly to the Chinese Communist Party. That's so funny in a way that, 70 years after
The Civil
Civil
War.
War, then suddenly it's like, okay, well, actually the KMT is the party that's in bed with the CCP.
Yeah. Well, I mean, political parties shift a lot over the course of
Well,
decades.
also, I mean, they put a lot of effort into
Ideological subversion.
trying to subvert the KMT and get it on their side. So
Yeah. So success.
yes,
But it's interesting, yeah. So you have major elections in 2020 where Chinese Communist Party influence or pressure will be a factor, a meaningful factor in the elections. And that's interesting because typically elections are primarily about domestic policy issues. And when a foreign adversary and your policy towards them becomes a major election issue, like that's a pretty big shift. So we're going to see it in the November elections in the U.S.
Do you
and
think
we're
so?
also going to see it in the U.S. presidential primaries, possibly. But I'm not sure it's going to become an issue in the Democratic primary. But it will for sure, no matter who the nominee is. Trump is going to bring up his favorite topic, which is China. And there's no way that's not going to be a major issue in the 2020 election.
yeah. I mean, usually it's a domestic politics, really. Trump foreign policy, but
Yeah, well, the Chinese Communist Party definitely has a lot riding on the U.S. election. But I got bad news for them, because when Vermin Supreme is voted in, they're toast.
what is Vermin Supreme's position on the Chinese Communist Party?
That's a good question.
I think we should interview him and ask him.
We could do that. This is also something I found out. Many of you apparently don't know. We have, I guess, a third show called America Uncovered, which you should also check out on YouTube.
Well, this is why we're so tired.
Yes, we have 3 shows, and
Yeah.
there's mainly 3 of us.
I also work another job. This is yeah.
Yeah.
This is all the pieces are starting to fall into place.
I mean,
And-
we do have other people who help. I mean, we have Seamus, our video editor, and we have some folks who help with America Uncovered.
Yes, mad props to them.
Yes.
But yeah, and we're traveling a lot.
Getting tear gassed.
We did do a bit of traveling this year because we went in May to Oslo, and then we went to Hong Kong, and then we went back to Hong Kong
and
then
DC,
DC.
twice.
Wow, twice to DC. DC is actually a more exhausting trip than you'd think, but it actually we did.
Well, that's because
so
we
much.
try to do things like cram 5 interviews and 3 events into 2 days.
And we
Yeah.
did that.
I do have to apologize to you guys for that because I was the one who planned that trip.
Actually, did we have 5 interviews?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and for those of you listening, the first interview with Ian Easton already came out on Monday, but you'll see the rest of them over the next few weeks.
Oh, and I can give you guys a preview of an upcoming podcast. We had Josh Phillips back on the podcast. You may remember him from a previous one about the history of communism. So we have another crazy one with him coming up
where we're
that's
talking
very
about
good.
China's unrestricted warfare, right?
China's unrestricted warfare and how communism kind of infiltrates and destroys a society.
Yeah, he talks about the ideological subversion of both the Soviets and the Chinese Communist Party.
So, it's really cheerful stuff.
That'll be our first podcast of 2020.
Ooh, what a way to kick off the year.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't see this getting any less busy next year.
What is going to happen is we are going to get busier and busier and busier, and then at some point in time, it will be over. The Communist Party will fall, and then we won't have to do...
Okay,
Two of
I
our
don't want
shows.
to Gordon Chang us here.
I said at some point.
Okay.
At some point, Shelley, the sun is going to explode. So,
Yeah.
I am Nostradamus,
I feel like
Cassandra.
it is hard to predict what will happen because nobody expected Hong Kong to happen the way it did.
Or the Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Hong Kong protests. I mean, even Hong Kong people we talked to, like
Didn't
2
expect.
weeks before the first protest
Denise
happened.
Ho,
Yeah,
2 weeks.
And we also talked to
Denise Ho was
Johnson,
like,
you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Denise Ho. We talked to her, and what was it like? The first
May.
like the
End
last
of
day of
May.
May, and she was like, "Oh, release the interview before June 9th because there's going to be a protest there, and I hope people can come."
And did they?
That was the million-person protest. So, yes.
So it just goes to show you never know.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? We might have to go to Hong Kong again.
I'm tired.
We might also have to go to Taiwan. I mean, who knows?
Guys, let's go to Taiwan for the presidential election.
Didn't we want to go to Antarctica too?
I want to go to Antarctica, but if we don't go in the next 2 months, I think we'd have to wait to the end of the year because
We can go to the Arctic then,
yeah.
because there's lots of stuff happening on the North Pole too.
Maybe we should go check out Greenland. Actually, that is true that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to buy up land in Greenland and stuff like that.
And the only way to stop it is for America to buy Greenland. It's a great deal.
Your
well,
impersonation of Trump has definitely gotten better over the past 4 years.
Yeah, I've
Has
had
it
a
been
lot of
that
time to
long?
3
practice.
years.
Oh, okay.
Oh my gosh, we have to go through a presidential election next year.
Oh, we're going to be really tired. But the real question is, how much will YouTube demonetize us in 2020?
Oh gosh, that was a horrible thing of this year. Just constant instant demonetization. Pretty much all of our Hong Kong stuff. Yeah, like these shows would be impossible to produce if it weren't for fans who have contributed on Patreon. So big end of the year shout out to everyone who supports both China Uncensored and America Uncovered on Patreon, because yeah, these shows would have shut down were it not for you guys and
Yes.
gals.
You help fund us because the CIA won't.
Yeah. Well, this goes back to we aren't the companies selling out basic human dignity for money.
Oh, I thought you were going to talk about how we're not NBC News with all of our resources.
I think it applies equally.
I mean, it is quite becoming more and more difficult to do this type of show on YouTube, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, it seemed like there was a nice period where like, oh, all these alternative news sources were kind of springing up and it was very great, and now the noose is tightening.
YouTube seems more interested in working with the larger, more established media companies.
YouTube wants to be Netflix, basically.
Yeah. But it is basically fan support, which is 75 to 80% of our income. And what it's allowed us to do is, like, we know that when we cover Hong Kong, there's a very, very high likelihood of us making zero money on YouTube from that, or close to zero. And so if that was all of our revenue, we just wouldn't be able to cover it all. We just wouldn't have a show because we couldn't pay ourselves. We couldn't hire a video editor. We just couldn't travel, anything. And so our calculation is like, we're going to do the episode anyway, knowing what we're going to face from YouTube, and we're going to do it because we rely on viewer support. And that decision has just allowed us to do the kind of coverage that, I just don't think there's a lot of channels out there that are covering Hong Kong the way that we have, and we've covered Hong Kong once or twice a week for the last 6 months.
There are definitely no other YouTube channels doing this kind of thing, but you're saying like CNN's not exactly covering Hong Kong all the time.
It's mostly
anymore.
impeachment stuff now.
Yeah.
But I think, that's the thing with China news. It's such a specific thing that, that we've been doing for the last 7 years. And I think we see more and more people kind of coming to the realization that this is important because it's affecting a lot of other things in the world.
Yeah.
Even we're coming more to the realization of that all the time. Like when we interview human rights activists in Bolivia or Cambodia and Mauritania, and they're like, oh,
Eritrea.
This is how the Chinese Communist Party is propping up the authoritarian regime of my country.
Yeah.
Or we talk to interviewees like General Spalding, who talks about like the economic, all of these, U.S. pensions are invested in basically the island building in the South China Sea.
The next couple of years really is a battle between liberty and democracy and communism and authoritarianism. That, my friends, is a prediction you can count on.
Thank you, Nostradamus.
Yeah.
I think this is... we do live in interesting times. But,
So-
I think we can adapt to YouTube. I think what we need to do is, kind of go with what YouTube wants to see more of. And we should do, China Uncensored Let's Plays and China Uncensored makeup tutorials.
And cat videos.
And
so
China
down.
Uncensored ASMR videos. And,
Another alternative is if you want us to keep making shows as we have been, you can support China Uncensored at patreon.com/China Uncensored. You can support America Uncovered at patreon.com/America Uncovered. And you can support this podcast by going to go.pathofcha.com/unscripted and buying some tea.
Before we have to set up a separate channel just for the panda videos.
Oh, I shudder. Well, thanks for joining us. This has been an incredible year, and really, we could not have done it without you.
Oh, before we go, can I give you guys your Christmas presents?
What?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't have the physical things right now, which you'll see why in a moment, but you can see what
It's
they
a
are
bomb?
here. So
Is that...
Oh.
So this is something called,
Whoa.
and we'll put on some images up, but this is a Kickstarter called Bricks Revolution by a Hong Kong artist called Uncle Plastic. And what he's done is he's created these figurines from the Hong Kong protests using Lego-compatible bricks.
Oh, wow. I'm finally being shown the picture.
Yeah.
So these are really cool.
So you can basically, choose. There's these figurines that look like, a protester, a frontline protester, or a member of the press, or a first aid person.
And then there's the Carrie Lam one.
Yeah, he calls her Carefree Lamb because she
Aw.
doesn't care about anything. Yeah, and then there are two police figures. You probably can't see that clearly, but they're dogs.
Oh, I did not understand that.
Yeah.
Hey.
So they're kind of like humanoid dog figures.
Wait,
I'll show
so
you.
you're actually going to get the physical ones for us?
Yeah, so I've bought 3 figures and then on the Kickstarter, and you guys can pick, what you want.
I'm
Wow.
excited.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley.
I have a gift for you too coming. I can't wait to give it to you in the future.
But I thought it would be a nice way to commemorate our time in Hong Kong together and show some support for the Hong Kong protesters.
Well, on my desk I have, this was back when we were in Hong Kong for the 2014 Umbrella Movement. Back then, Hong Kong police were selling little tiny police figurines because they thought it was cute and people liked the police back then before the Umbrella Movement. And so somebody gave me, it was like a riot policeman holding up a tear smoke sign.
Which is odd that they had that because I don't think they had really used it before.
Yeah. So it was like, oh, look at this cute. And then like after they started doing that in the Umbrella Movement, they stopped producing those figurines.
But somebody had one. I remember, like, these are a little bigger than that, I think. But yeah, that's a really cute little police guy holding up the tear smoke sign, and now that's just what they're like all the time. They're just constantly geared up in riot gear and all this stuff. It's Hong Kong's changed a lot in the last 5 years.
Maybe we've changed a lot.
Has Hong Kong changed us?
Or have we changed Hong Kong?
Yeah, that's definitely what's happened. We have been the inspiration for Hong Kong.
I do have to say, though, that I so admire the Hong Kong people for basically being willing to stand up when, all of these way more powerful organizations and governments were too afraid to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
all these companies, all these politicians, oh, we can't anger China. Oh, let's get lots of money from China.
And then you have these, a lot of the frontline protesters are like 17, 18, 19-year-old, and they're basically just facing off against the world's largest authoritarian regime. And nobody expected them to keep going for this long. Nobody, and it's changing even the U.S. government.
They understand virtue. The
They're-
protesters, not the U.S. government.
But, you have like almost unanimous support for these bills that are supporting Hong Kong protesters. It's wild.
When Pelosi and Schumer and Cruz and Trump can all agree on something, it's something special.
It's just like, things are changing.
The true miracle of 2019
Is Hong Kong?
Yeah, and how it's changed people's perceptions. Yeah.
So once again, thanks for joining us. We're almost approaching the second-year anniversary of China Unscripted.
Has it? Oh my gosh! Yes, we
Yeah.
started this
Right after Australia in 2018.
Before Hong Kong this year, we had pre-planned all of our trips, but now I feel like I don't know where we're going next or when. It's an adventure.
A magic school bus. All right, let's take a nap. Thanks for listening. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
I'm Matt Gnezda.
And we'll see you in 2020.